evening, everybody, and welcome to the Baptista Forum. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Anna Ford Smith. I'm the Associate Director of Cerlac, the Center for Research on Latin America and the Caribbean at York University. And this is our second forum for this academic year in the Michael Baptista series. And we're so glad that you're able to be here with us. The Michael Baptista Lecture was established by the friends and family of Michael Baptista and the Royal Bank of Canada to recognize his love of learning, his Guyanese Caribbean roots, and his unqualified drive. We are grateful also to the LAPS Event Fund for their generous contribution to this series. Please allow me to introduce Colin Zia, who is a graduate student in the Faculty of Political Science here at York, and whose work focuses on settler states and indigeneity. Colin is one of the researchers who, along with Jelisa Ricketts, works on our new IARIC initiative, a special initiative focused on building Black, Indigenous, and Caribbean student community and scholarship. Colin is going to offer the land acknowledgement for us tonight.
Thank you, Honor. Good evening, everyone. I'm Colin. So before today's discussion can begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I myself and many others are currently situated in Toronto. This area has been traditionally cared for by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. Today, it's home to many other First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. And I want to acknowledge that the current treaty holders are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that this territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement that many of us are implicated in and has yet to be honored. Since today is about the unthinkable, my hope is to prompt everyone to confront some of the unthinkable violences occurring on this land. And I think having virtual spaces like this to learn in is also an opportunity to reflect on some of the strained and difficult relationships we have with the land and its Indigenous caretakers. And whenever I attend events centered on the Black diaspora, I'm reminded that Black radical traditions itself stem from a loss of Indigenous land. And in this common pain, I think there's also space to consider Black Indigenous relationalities and the many ways that we need to care for Indigenous peoples as our kin in co-resistance. And with that said, I'll pass it back to Honor. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Colin. I just want to say a word about the IARIC initiative, which Colin works on along with Jelisa Ricketts. It was inaugurated in the fall as a result of the struggles of Black students here at York University. And since its beginning, it has initiated something called the Black Table Initiative, a naming inspired by Professor David Trotman, a long-standing fellow here at Cerlac, who gave a lecture last year on Black histories at York and Black struggles at York. The Black Table initiative kicked off in February with a reasoning entitled The Art of Black Research Creation, which featured the work of Camille Turner and Natalie Wood, two prominent artists here in Toronto. The next Black Table is scheduled for March the 15th, so please save the date. It will focus on Black radical thought and will bring together scholars and students in a panel on the topic. It is Black History Month, and there are many things to think about in this strange COVID February in regard to that theme. So we thought it would be appropriate to organize a panel inspired by the work of the late Haitian historian Michel-Rolph Trouillot, whose work, Silencing the Past, reflects deeply on how power produces history and memory and how it enables our future. We thought we could best do that by inviting artist scholars from the region to imagine and reflect on emancipatory horizons through the work of Trouillot and through the ideas behind his work. I want to hand over to Celia Romulus, who's the chair of tonight's panel, to explain a bit more about what the panel will comprise. Celia is one of our newest fellows at Cerlac. She joined Glendon's Department of International Studies as a professor in July, and she completed her PhD in the Department of Political Science at Queen's University, where her research focused on the normalization of gendered state repression under the Duvalier dictatorship, and how these systematized forms of violence have shaped movements of people out of Haiti and the notion of citizenship as experienced by multiple generations of migrants. I'm going to turn it over to Celia now, who will steer us through tonight as chair. Thanks so much, Celia, for coming, and thanks to all our panelists.
Well, thank you for inviting me to chair this panel. I'm very excited. So yes, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about, I would say, housekeeping and the logistics of our panel. I'll have the privilege of introducing each panelist and also to guide you or facilitate the Q&A. But before I do that, maybe I will try to contextualize or provide you with contextual information regarding our conversation. So yes, Michel-Rolph Trouillot's work is the inspiration for our conversation tonight. So I think it's also important for us to keep in mind that before or in parallel of being a scholar, Michel-Rolph Trouillot was also a songwriter, was also a historian and an activist involved in political protests against the Duvalier dictatorship and against the American government's treatment of undocumented Haitian immigrants. I say that because I think that it's interesting to keep in mind that he produced like scholarship with other types of work in communities that mobilized historical transmission, but also art in order to mobilize, politicize, alter the course of politics, and more importantly, create and dream the unthinkable. So I think it's a good way to maybe allow us to sit with important questions and ask ourselves how art can allow us to unsilence or unearth marginalized narratives or narratives of resistance to injustices, also to basically document stories and experiences, and finally allow us to dream about different futures and societies. So that being said, I will introduce our first panelist. And thank you again for joining us from a different time zone and to speak with us, although it's super late where you are. So I have the pleasure of introducing Roshini Campadou, who's a media artist, photographer, and scholar. Roshini creates artworks that interpret and reimagine experiences of the particular and everyday relating to historical legacies and memories by Caribbean persons and its diaspora. She evokes women's perspectives through photographs, fictional writings, recordings, music, interactivity, and networked environments. Roshini's current research and artistic practice explores audiovisual methodologies of Black, Indigenous, and persons of colors in relation to Caribbean extraction, sustainability, and ecological activism. Thank you again for being with us, and take it away.
Thank you, Celia, and thanks to Honor for inviting me and Camilla for introducing me and meeting for the first time. I'm really excited to join my other panelists as well and to listen to them. So I'm going to just share the screen and I'm going to talk through a project that I've been working on that I started in 2019. And I'll start with that. So I hope everybody can see that. And I'm just really going to talk through, let me just go here, sorry. Yeah, so I'll do some reading as well. Like Gold Dust, which is the name of the project, is inspired by the opportunity and a return visit to Guyana and being a guest of the First Nations in Wakapoa, Guyana. Additionally, meeting Latina activists, Amelia Ortez, Tihana poet, activist, Mextep, Marco Cervantes, and the late Maria Ibarra. And this was in San Antonio in Texas. So it's this combination of being in Texas and going to Guyana and having the opportunity to travel to Guyana. And my interest as an artist and scholar is to research, write, and create a practice that contributes to transforming and thinking through more progressive and sustainable ways, as Celia has mentioned, of contributing to cultural imagination in response to our planetary crisis, ecological, social, and political. I don't know why this is happening. Oh, sorry. Just move on. But I wanted to start with T.J. Demos's quote, and this has often helped me to focus on my approach and to think about why I'm creating work and how I think about my responsibility as an artist and researcher. And I think that's been underlying my practice, you know, from the beginning, in terms of how the perspective and the way in which I think about that, that inaction, if you like, of making work. So the proposition that T.J. Demos suggests to us is to think about a visuality with political legibility, with decolonial and anti-capitalist values, with focus on the structural causes and the justice-based solutions. And I think for me, that's one of the things that really underpins what I'm trying to do, have been trying to do. So virtual exiles is an image I'm showing you here, is to evoke the position of the researcher. And you can read on the blackboard where I've worked with a quote that talks about this idea of digging in the archives and thinking about this, the way in which history displaces us, if you like. Where there is, and I think about the significance of our positions as a researcher and artist, where so many of us have deep and intimate and complex, and yet at times remote knowledge of elsewhere, other countries or indigenous cultures, through a diasporic background, memories, or deep familial histories. As Amy Stillman notes, we might reconstruct knowledge systems with an insistence on living as multitudinous layers, languages, or experiential inheritance from the past. In this sense, as a researcher and scholar and artist, experiential inheritance offers a sentiment of how we might think about the archives, as those with embodied histories of slavery, indentureship, or indigenous backgrounds. We can contribute something additional, enriching, expansive, in relation to colonial and post-colonial lands, spaces, people, action. Just to say a little bit about the artwork and the piece that I made in 2019, it was mobilized as a response to the state Guyana finds itself in as it lurches towards becoming one of the largest planetary offshore sites of oil and gas mining spaces, a petrochemical state. And I just wanted to share with you some of the recent announcements made about this expansion, if you like, and this forming of the petrochemical state. Guyana government was at COP26 in 2021, where it the politicians stated that Guyana will reduce carbon emissions by 70% in 2030. February 2022, the oil revenues have tripled in 2022 to almost $1 billion. And for example, in January 2022, we have 3 Guyanese women who have filed a case against Guyana's Environmental Protection Agency to put a stop to flaring of gas offshore by ExxonMobil. We've got Seneca Henry, Adriska Thorington, and Sherlina Nagia, and supported by Millian Janke. And it's this last announcement and activism that women have mobilized that I am interested in as someone who wants to give voice to women's experiences, narratives, and actions. Like Gold Dust was the first iteration of a long-term artwork that will morph from when I first installed it in 2019, particularly in light of the pandemic and urgency. This was based on a residency at Art Pace in San Antonio. So just to talk, as the title implies, like Gold Dust implies a visceral sense of our relationship to key metals and earth resources used for the development and used to make, sorry, I've lost my place now, used for the development and used to make us, particularly the West, modern societies. Gold dust gives us a sense of the preciousness and commodity financial value that we give to gold as a precious mineral. And this is a map of Guyana where the oil is being extracted. I'd like to talk more. Here I attribute gold dust to the presentist and future magical qualities of Guyanese women and their knowledge as survivors, as warriors, as keepers of forests and terrains, of people and things in the landscape. The environmental lawyer, as Melinda Janke mentioned, the environmental lawyer from the Justice Institute in Guyana who is seeking legal recourse, has explained the current agreement with the Guyana government will put Guyana into debt to the oil companies, and needless to say, poses environmental risks and political risks. So based on a return visit to Guyana in 2019, as a daughter of Guyanese parents of the Windrush generation and someone who lived in Guyana during my teenage years, I was very interested in thinking most importantly about the First Nations of Guyana, Guyanese indigenous communities, like most nations elsewhere, have a torturous and brutal history of an injustice, reservation living, land displacement, and systemic persecution and genocide through a colonial history, coming into the firing line with this expansion of Guyana as a petro state. The work then seeks to embed legacies of commodification through slavery and capitalism and the activism to counter it. My response to my memories of and witnessing in the contemporary landscape was to do with exposing the slow violence of colonialism and its relationship to its practice of environmental extractivism. And I'm very interested in this notion of slow violence and its connection to colonialism. The artwork needed to be about women's experiences of this, counter narratives to the robust masculine voice, and vision of extraction of resources, imagining a world that contributes to activism, voicing the cumulative violence to women's bodies, violence to landscapes, oceans, in other words, continued ecological devastation. And you can see some more of these images, of the images I've taken here. Like Gold Dust, I created a silent video entitled A Cautionary Statement as part of the installation. And I'll just play a short extract here so you can get a sense of it. Remember, it's silent. And it's really to give the cautionary statement is an interesting title that is a technical term that's used in prospecting and associated with approximate guesstimates of wealth, if you like, or guesstimates of wealth. I'll just play that for you now. And these are just some of the kind of the research material that I worked with. In this sense, Like Gold Dust offers us a symbolic visualizations of white economics and its connections to the notion of extraction of resources, indigenous dispossession, through a layering of aesthetics of rupture and fragmentation. And here you can see how oil starts to work into the narrative of the nation in a way, and the impact of it, of course, here. So these are some of the photographs I created and montaged together and worked with. Two women figures are present in the photographs. It correlates with the audio monologue in the gallery space. I envision them in the photographs as actors and activists, as confident women in defiant poses, montaged into a Texan landscape with residues of the afterlife of slavery and colonialism. I was interested in the performative act of defiance, confidence, confrontation, a willing embodied enunciation as an act of insistence, of presence that Winter suggests in her phrase, a hybrid auto-instituting languaging storytelling species, to remind us of the transformative powers of poetic knowledges as people and women who are not merely biological beings, but inscript ourselves into being, and had claimed that we were never human, and the need to fundamentally take into account the way in which we narrate ourselves. And that's become quite an important kind of moment for me to think about how that kind of presenting might take place. So in that sense, I also worked with the audio script, and you'll see an extract here from it, but it's narrating in a very particular way. And I'm thinking about activists who, I'll just stay on this, activists who have informed and influenced me. And I'm thinking about, people like Mextep or Amalia Ortiz, or people in Guyana, such as those from Red Thread, Karen D'Souza and I, rest in power, or Alisa Trotz, who's in Canada. So women evoked as agents of environmental and socio-political change through the dialogue as fictional characters, within which Rosa names Wangari Maathai. And what's interesting about that is to think through this idea of Wangari Maathai's writing, in particular, her autobiographical sense of where she thinks through a kind of an emplaced rhetoric. And that was something I was trying to capture in the script and the piece that you hear with sound and music. So I'm interested in imagining futurescapes that put forward the idea of a more sustainable, more than human life experience. A possibility of a future, particularly in this moment, is not only acknowledging the writings of more pessimistic nihilism, apocalyptic and dystopian images, but also to consider possibilities, glimpses from the space of which the imagination escapes and takes flight. The poem, as part of the installation by Sarah Russell, Little Crow Russell, I used in the gallery space with her permission, offers a sharply focused commentary of elements involving protests through performance. A historical narrative, and beneath the surface of the earth are lurking the possibility of revolution once more. Other planets associated with other worlds in which this planet was not for us, or technological prosthetics and extensions to the human body are all proposed as new knowledge. I infer in this project, like Gold Dust, an alchemy of and by women, with sounds, readings, and visuals as a magical process, combining transformation and creation, imagining and counterbalancing the systemic violence towards Black bodies. And to think a little bit about activism on this planet, in this space and place. here and now is also with another possibility. The work by the First Nations that I encountered in Texas, for example, continued to remind us of that idea of protest movements and poetic spaces. So earth elements containing memories such as trees, their roots, dust, soil, river, water, wake are posed as alternative evocations. As a cultural activist, I'm concerned with transformational cultural work that proposes questions and comments. It is this evocation of an inextricable link I gesture towards, a fictional and imagined space, and a link that contains possibilities that also embeds the historical stuff of legacies and nightmares. Slavery followed by indentureship, the violence towards and displacement acts of First Nation peoples by settler colonies, inhuman acts, white privilege and supremacy. The work gestures towards how we might constitute our Black bodies as sovereign, autonomous women. How does this kind of thinking and being make a step change in our relationship to the materiality of the landscape and terrain for a more recognizable futurescape? So I'll end it there. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to join in the conversation later. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much for presenting your work, for a rich presentation. So I will, before I introduce our second panelist, I'm just going to remind participants that you can start, I would say, posting reactions or questions in the Q&A, and that we will address them later, but feel free to start reacting. Now I will introduce our second panelist. So Courtney Desiree Morris, who's a visual and conceptual artist and an assistant professor of gender and women's studies at the University of California, Berkeley. She teaches courses on critical race theory, feminist theory, Black social movements in the Americas, women's social movements in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as race and environmental politics in the African diaspora. She's a social anthropologist and is currently completing a book entitled To Defend the Sunrise, Black Women's Activism and the Geography of Race in Nicaragua, which examines how Black women activists have resisted historical and contemporary patterns of racialized state violence, economic exclusion, territorial dispossession, and political repression from the 19th century to the present. Courtney, thank you for being here with us today. We're listening to you.
Thank you, Celia, for the introduction, and to the event organizers for inviting me to be here. It's a real pleasure to be in the company of these scholars and artists whose work I have great respect and admiration for. So thank you for having me. And Roshini, thank you for that really rich and elegant talk. There's so many points of resonance between some of the more recent work that I've been doing. So I really look forward to, I'm not going to talk about that work in this talk, but I would love to just dig more into the things that you're doing. And also wanted to take a moment to just elevate the name of Maria Ibarra, who I had the opportunity to meet when I lived in Austin, and who I knew not very well, but was very familiar with her work as a cultural activist in San Antonio. So loose for her spirit. But I want to begin today by sort of thinking about, as Celia was saying, I've been working for many years on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua and have recently finished a book that's now in production, hooray, through Rutgers University Press. And it's been an interesting experience because I think I've thought a lot about Nicaragua as a scholar, and it's only within the last couple of years that I've really begun to kind of think more about Nicaragua through my practice as a visual and performance artist. So this invitation to be a part of this conversation felt like an invitation to really deepen that kind of aesthetic inquiry into the nature of my work in Nicaragua. And so that's what I'll be talking about today. And so the presentation that I want to share with you is entitled Impossible Coast. And let me just share my screen real quick. Okay, excellent. So Bluefield, Nicaragua is a place that exists somewhere between Latin America and the Caribbean. The history of this impossible place remains a vexed site of struggle in larger debates on the project of settler colonial mestizo nationalism. This project of monoracial nationalism, which has recently devolved into a systematic and brutal campaign of authoritarian democracy, a process that I explore more deeply in my forthcoming book, To Defend This Sunrise, Black Women's Activism and the Authoritarian Turn in Nicaragua, has historically faltered when it has encountered the multiracial, heterogeneous Black and Indigenous peoples of the Caribbean coast, who have been largely relegated to the margins of the apocryphal romantic narratives of Nicaraguan nation building that the country tells itself about itself. In many ways, Bluefields and the coast writ large remains an illegible and impossible geography in the mestizo racial imagination. I've worked on the coast since 2004, studying the racial geography of Nicaragua and Black women's activism in the struggle for land rights and against authoritarian state violence. When I began my research, I did what most scholars typically do. I turned to the archive. Yet looking for Black women in the archive proved to be a constant exercise in disappointment and failure. There were and remain few traces of Black women in these official archives. When they do appear, they are often dismissed as marginal side players, footnotes in the stories of the men who really make history, or so distorted as to be rendered unrecognizable. In many ways, this historical disappearing of Black women as key actors in the social and political life of the region reflects contemporary patterns of erasure and misrepresentation that mark Black women as impossible subjects who, quote, as Saidiya Hartman says, fall outside of the order of representation altogether, end quote. They appear in historical photos as nameless figures, the Creole belles serving pastries during local elections, recent Moravian converts performing Christian piety for the photographer, a woman in white placed carefully among the flora and fauna, a regal and fair-skinned beauty queen surrounded by the symbols and regalia of the UNIA, a Miskito girl staring into the camera. And I want to also mention that there's a really very incredible young scholar named Melanie White who's been doing some really interesting and I think very important work on the subject of colonial photography and kind of thinking about visual practices of kind of taming and domesticating the quote unquote native subject through these sort of acts of visual representation. And I've been really inspired by the work that she's doing. But in these visual representations, Black women are rendered, quote, neither subject or object, but a mute silence thing, like an impossible metaphor or a beached whale or a form yet to be named, end quote. In my research, as I struggled to locate Black women in the archive, I encountered the work of June Beer. Beer is widely considered the most renowned artist of the Caribbean coast and the first Black woman to establish herself in the larger Nicaraguan art world. Born in 1935 to a well-to-do Creole family in Bluefields, Beer would defy the expectations of her community to choose marriage, family, and domesticity, and instead become an artist, a radical, and a dedicated supporter of the Sandinista revolution. She traveled to Los Angeles in the 1950s, where she worked as an art model for a time, and apparently she modeled for the well-known African-American actress Ruby Dee, who gifted her her first set of paintbrushes, with which she then began to paint nude self-portraits of herself. Beer returned to Nicaragua in the late 1960s, moving between Bluefields and Managua to pursue her craft as an artist. A self-taught painter, she developed her own style of painting that reflected the landscapes, daily activities, cultural traditions, and racial diversity of the peoples of the Caribbean coast. This work reflected her intense interest in capturing the daily lives of costeños, particularly Black people, as well as her own emergent feminist consciousness. Much of her work featured portraits of Black women represented in their roles as mothers, workers, and revolutionaries. One portrait features a Black woman with a small natural dressed in army fatigues, her right fist raised defiantly in the air. Another offers a rendering of the Nicaraguan revolutionary hero Augusto Sandino as a Black man. If there was little attention paid to the participation of Afro-Nicaraguan women in the revolutionary project, Beer painted them and herself into that history, carving out a space for Black women's radical self-making. And in a lot of ways, for me, when I encountered her, June's work, I remember just being really struck by how, the sort of aesthetics of her practice also were, reflective of a kind of larger set of political commitments, and the ways that she was, centrally preoccupied with thinking about Blackness in kind of spatial and geographical terms, and really thinking about the place of Blackness within the landscapes of the Caribbean coast, but also within the kind of larger project of Nicaraguan nation building and discourses of Nicaraguan nationalism. While there's been a tendency among Nicaraguan art historians and cultural critics to read Beer's work in a largely folkloric manner, and this is a fact that I feel like has remained the case even as her work has finally begun to receive some very long overdue recognition, as demonstrated by a flurry of recent solo exhibitions in the past few years and the celebration of her work in the 2016 Nicaraguan Art Biennial. I want to suggest that part of the enduring significance of Beer's body of work is how it counters the disappearance of Black women in the archive through the construction of a visual counter-archive that privileges intimate space, the body, and desire as sites of Black femme freedom and possibility. And there's something that, you know, I really resonated with Roshini's sort of analysis about thinking about the ways that Black women activists and cultural workers are also engaged and also have sort of valuable and important forms of knowledge that they hold that are kind of a central part of the work that they're doing. And I think that there was a similar kind of sensibility at work in Beer's creative practice. What's always been most striking to me in looking at June's paintings is how she visually narrates Black female desire in its many forms. It's from June that I learned how art might function as a prefigurative practice of Black femme freedom and futurity. In her germinal work Against Purity, Living Ethically in Compromised Times, Alexis Shotwell defines prefiguration as a practice of, quote, living in the present a world we want to create and crafting that world through our living, end quote. It's a practice of impossible desire, an attempt to call a new world into being through embodied practices of erotic autonomy and self-fashioning that refuses the normative terms of citizenship and national belonging. Beer's work, which centers Black women dancing, holding their mixed-race children in their laps, embedded in nature, hanging out with their friends, or portraits where the subject stares back at the viewer with an unflinching gaze, really speak to all the kind of mundane and quotidian ways that she identified Black women attempting to enact their desires for an otherwise, for an elsewhere, in ways that might not have been readily available to them in their present moment. And so I've been coming back to, you know, when I was writing my dissertation and writing my book, I thought a lot about June as a kind of political figure, and I talk a lot about her in my work in that way. But, you know, recently I've been thinking a lot about how to be in conversation with June as an artist now that I've kind of really begun to develop my own creative practice. And while the roots of my creative practice as a visual, conceptual, and performance artist are multiple, one root most certainly lies in Nicaragua and my ongoing encounters and engagements with the work of June Beer. In 2009, and these are some more, you can see some more of herself of these portraits here, these beautiful portraits that she completed of Black women and girls that I love so much. And so, you know, in 2009, as I was conducting a year of field work in Bluefields, I began to take a series of self-portraits, photographs, and kind of documentary photographs that really focused on capturing sort of everyday aspects of Black and Indigenous social life in the region. And at the time, I didn't really think of myself as an artist. And I was really sort of invested in thinking about my, you know, sort of my primary identity as an anthropologist and as a scholar. But even in that moment, I had already found myself really exhausted by my attempts, you know, as Michel-Rolph writes, to kind of push against the granite wall of Western, sort of liberal Western epistemology. And, you know, and I could see all the ways that a desire to sort of know and inhabit the world in a different way, to sort of know the world otherwise, really was apparent in the sort of ways that I began to try to document the region and Black women's lives in the region through my visual practice. And I have to admit that I haven't looked at these photos in many years. It's been about 10 years since I've looked at these photographs. And so, you know, the invitation to this conversation is really what prompted me to begin to revisit them and to reconsider what they might mean in larger aesthetic and political and theoretical terms. But I can see now, with the benefit of time and distance, how many of the questions that Beer takes up in her work, particularly her thinking about Blackness as a spatial formation and her exploration of Black women's intimate geographies, continues to shape my own creative practice in ways that I'm sort of only really beginning to make sense of. And so what I want to do is just kind of show a few of the photographs that that I have been revisiting, and sort of thinking about the ways that they articulate with my kind of larger body of work. And, you know, as I said earlier, I didn't add all the photographs of other things that I've been doing, but, you know, a lot of my visual practice really focuses on understanding sort of the context of Blackness in specific social landscapes and kind of geopolitical contexts. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last 7 years has really focused on tracing my family's migrations throughout the United States and the Caribbean, looking at their encounters with specific industries, particularly the sugar industry in South Florida and the petrochemical industry of Southern Louisiana, and kind of thinking about how to create my own sort of archive of Black social life in these landscapes where the attempts to erase the presence of Black people in both physical and kind of discursive terms is unfolding with kind of frightening speed and violence. And these are things that, you know, at the time when I began doing this work, I hadn't really thought about the ways that my experiences in Nicaragua and engaging with the work of Junbir really animated my approach to thinking about the relationship between place and Blackness. And so, you know, these are some of the photographs that I took while I was there. This is a photograph of the Bluefields Bay, which I could see from my house. And which is a kind of geography that centers very, you know, that's a kind of central location and a lot of kind of visual representations of the region. There's another image here, and part of why I like these images is that they remind me a lot of the kind of 19th century and early 20th century postcards that you would see coming out of Central America that would, you know, circulate globally, that people would send. A lot of Black labor migrants, you would find these in their collections of things that they were sending to people in different parts of the world. And so I kind of wanted to try to recreate that sense of like the postcard. And so this is a piece called Dashi. There are these other sort of representations of, you know, kind of everyday Black social life. So looking at, you know, representations of like kinship and family and scenes of domesticity, like interior spaces. A lot of June's work grapples with those kinds of questions, and I wanted to sort of think about how intimate spaces can be sites for the performance of ephemeral types of freedom. And so, you know, it's been a really interesting exercise to think about how these images also speak to the ways in which, you know, we might examine the relationship of the body to public space, the relationship of the Black body to the natural and built environment, and how the body also functions as a site of memory. This is another photos that I took of called Comparsa, that's about Black dance troupes performing in the city. This photograph is Abandonada, which in a lot of ways also for me spoke to kind of larger questions around regional and like political neglect of the region, and the ways that the state is both present and absent in sort of everyday coast life. It's an alley. Again, in a lot of these pieces, there, you know, I wasn't able to find all of the paintings that June completed, and there to date has never been a kind of full catalog of her work completed, which I think is actually a problem, and it seems like there are folks who are working on it. But one of the things that, you know, one of the kind of recurring themes in her work is how she will cite Black women within domestic spaces, and so placing Black women in kind of traditional, what are called traditional board houses built out of wood, built on a kind of modeled after kind of Caribbean style forms of architecture. And, you know, often women will be represented nude in these spaces. And so there's also something I always found really moving about the way that she sort of centered her gaze on sort of intimate spaces of Black life, and how Black women articulate their own sort of forms of desire and pleasure within these everyday kind of quotidian spaces. And here's another one. This was another kind of interior scene that, you know, that is reminiscent of Beer's work. And these are a series of self-portraits that I shot on a beach in Sandy Bay. And, you know, again, just sort of thinking about how to sort of rethink the Black female body. And, it's been in the context of sort of Nicaraguan representations of Blackness and sort of Black femininity. There's a tendency to kind of conflate the Black female body with the landscape of the Atlantic coast. And I wanted to sort of think about how to trouble that connection, or how to think about ways to articulate connections to land that don't sort of reify existing sort of forms of racial discourse that do violence to the Black female body, but that sort of center Black women as keepers of knowledge about place in ways that I think are really important. So I'm going to stop there and pass it over back to Celia. But thank you again for the invitation, and I look forward to discussing more of this project as it evolves with everyone. Thank you.
So great. Thank you so much, Courtney, for sharing your work about engaging with counterarchives, but also constituting your own. That's great. I will introduce our third panelist. So next we will be listening to Gina Athena Ulysse, a Haitian American artist, anthropologist, and professor of feminist studies at UC Santa Cruz. Her research questions engage geopolitics, historical representations, materiality, and aesthetics in the dailiness of Black diasporic conditions to confront the visceral and indestructible. Her work and artistic practice are rooted in what she calls rassemblage, a gathering of people, things, ideas, and spirits, not necessarily in that order. She is the author of several books and articles, including Why Haiti Needs New Narratives, a post-quake chronicle, and Because When God is Too Busy, Haiti, Me and the World, a collection of photographs, poetry, and performing texts. Gina, thank you so much for being with us. And yes, we're listening to you.
Starts with a clean slate. You can't hide. But the historicity of the human condition always requires that practices of power and domination be renewed. The world, recreated humankind, is master of a new fate, strengthened by a new experience of life. The fruitfulness of this admirable doctrine that it poses to each of us, the immediate problems from which it is impossible to shy away without cowardice. It is now vital to dare to know oneself, to dare to confess to oneself what one is, to dare to ask oneself what one wants to be. Without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. We not only end up confused, rudderless, and cynical, but we forget that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us. If your house ain't in order, you ain't in order. Revolution begins with the self, in the self. I exist as I am, and that is enough. I exist as I am, and that is enough. I exist as I am, and that is enough. Because we are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. Ready or not, here I come. You can't hide. Gonna find you and take it slowly. Ready or not, Here I come, you can't hide. Gonna find you and take it slowly. Magua. Marien. Saragua. Maguana. Igwe. A shipload of items traded and exchanged for 500 enslaved Africans. Karis, 20,000 pounds. Coarse German linen, 1,500 pieces. Cotton length 30 yards white, 100 pieces. Cotton length 30 yards blue, 50 pieces. Cotton length 15 yards white, 250 pieces. Cotton length calico with large flowers, 150 pieces. Cotton length striped, 130 pieces. Firearms, 200. Copper or brass basins from 3 pounds to 8 pounds, 600 pounds. Gunpowder for small arms, 1,000 pounds. Iron bars, 1,006 pounds. Coral, 50. Dutch pipe, best doors, 5 boxes, 50. Beads and glass toys of different colors. This is a list of a shipload of items traded and exchanged for 500 enslaved Africans. Neither blood nor belonging accounted for our presence. I closed my eyes and strained to hear the groans and cries that once echoed in the dungeon, but the space was mute. I am reminded that 12 million crossed the Atlantic Ocean and the past is not yet over. I am the progeny of captives. I am the vestige of the dead. I am the vestige of the dead. I am the vestige of the dead. And history is how the secular world attends to the dead. Not only humans made the crossing. Traveling in one direction through ocean, given the name Atlantic, grief traveled as well. Grief traveled as well. Grief traveled as well. The dead do not like to be forgotten. The dead do not like to be forgotten. The dead do not like to be forgotten, especially those whose lives had come to a violent end and had been stacked in high in a sea of mass graves. Egg Aguila Negra from France. Voyage began July 16, 1702. 500 boarded, 107 survived. Marie-Françoise, France. Voyage began May 19, 1726. 400 boarded, 80 survived. Saint-Jacques, France. Voyage began October 2nd, 1741. 239 boarded, 162 survived. Aigle, France. Voyage began July 12, 1786. 391 boarded, 260 survived. You get any boga for your family? Have you ever wondered why it is all we seem to have learned from you? It's how to corrupt our societies and how to be tyrants. You will have to accept that it is mostly your fault.
Let me show you how you look to us. You came, you took things that were not yours. You took things that were not yours. You took things that were not yours. And you did not even, for appearance's sake, ask first. You could have said, may I have this, please? And even though it would have been clear to everybody that a yes or no from us would have been of no consequence, you might have looked so much better. Believe me, it would have gone a long way. I would have had to admit that at least you were polite. When reality does not coincide with deeply held beliefs, human beings tend to phrase interpretations that force reality within the scope of these beliefs. They devise formulas to repress the unthinkable and to bring it back within the realm of accepted discourse. Undoubtedly, there comes a specific moment when political events occur as if by destiny, regardless of our wishes. The human spirit progresses and often inspires some inner process which ultimately shakes nations and leads them to unavoidable commotions, from which emerges a new era with institutions that are better suited to the times. But these events are the results of specific forces. They are produced by specific factors. We cannot neglect the least of these factors if we are to understand these events. Every owner of slaves shall, whenever possible, ensure that his slaves belong to as many ethno-linguistic groups as possible. If they cannot speak to each other, they cannot foment rebellion and revolution. Kill them off, kill them off, kill them off, and get new ones who know nothing of liberty and equality. There is no movement among our Negroes. There is no movement among our Negroes. They are very tranquil and obedient. A revolt among them is impossible. Oh, we have nothing to fear on the part of the Negroes. We sleep with our doors and windows wide open. Freedom for Negroes is a chimera. Well, there was only two methods of subverting a colonial system so long and deeply rooted in time and prejudice. The one, gradual, emanated from our oppressors themselves. The other, sudden and violent, originated with the oppressed and was contrary to the wishes of our tyrants. We used the last method. We used the last method. We used the last method. Indeed, it is not enough to be free of whips, principalities, and powers. You pay me off, you savages. Build me an equitable human assertion. Build me an equitable human assertion. Build me an equitable human assertion. One that looks like a jungle, or one that looks like the cities of the West. But I provide the stock, the beast, the myths. Some things go on. Some things just stay. I used to think it was just my rememory. Some things you forget, other things you never do. Some things you forget, other things you never do. None of us starts with a clean slate. None of us start with a clean slate. None of us. But the historicity of the human condition also requires that practices of power and domination be renewed. If your house ain't in order, you ain't in order. The world, recreated humankind is master of a new fate, strengthened by a new experience of life. The fruitfulness of this admirable doctrine that it poses to each of us, the immediate problem from which it is impossible to shy away without cowardice, it is now vital to dare to know oneself, to dare to confess to oneself what one is, to dare to ask oneself what one wants to be. Without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. We not only end up confused, rudderless and cynical, but we forget that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us. Revolution begins with the self, in the self. Revolution begins with the self, in the self, for this space between power and vulnerability is not just an edge. There is room there. There is room there. There is room there. There is room for deference. There is room for humility. There is room for surrender. And there is room for grace. Thank you. So, I just want to tell you very quickly that the first piece is from a sound installation in equitable human assertion that was at the Biennale of Sydney in 2020, this massive thing that I was invited to create. And part of the sound, part of the script is what I read today is from a project called Black Liberation Mashup. And I think people who are lit people would have identified a number of the quotations that you heard. So I'm in conversation here with, I'm just gonna read them off very quickly. So D.R. Hartman, M. Jackie Alexander, Jamaica Kincaid, Michel-Rolph Trouillot, Antonio Filmet, Norbert C. Phillips, C.L.R. James, Baron DeVeste, Kamau Brathwaite, Amiri Baraka, Toni Morrison, Suzanne Césaire, of course, and Toni Kate Bambara, Robin D.G. Kelly, as well as Lisa Bailey. And it's part of an ongoing project, just thinking through and working with works that have been done by artists, thinkers, activists, academics, and who are just at the forefront, have been at the forefront of this question of Black liberation. And for me, it was really important to, as a Haitian American feminist artist, to move Haiti away from the narrative of exceptionalism and show that it's more connected to the rest of the Black world and vice versa. So that's my point here, is that Haiti's been at the avant-garde, and that's where I'm gonna take us into conversation. And thank you so much, Honor, and everyone for the invitation. And I look forward to engaging with everybody.
Thank you so much, Gina. Aye, Bobo.
Aye, Bobo.
All right. I will now introduce Tamara Toledo, who will kind of like lead us in, like, I would say, sitting with all of that work and like questions. So Tamara Toledo is a Chilean-born, Toronto-based scholar, curator, and artist. Graduate of the Ontario College of Art and Design University. She holds an MFA, sorry about that, from York University, and is a PhD art history and visual culture candidate at York University. Toledo is co-founder of the Allende Arts Festival and the Latin American Canadian Arts Project. And for over a decade, she has curated numerous exhibitions offering spaces and opportunities to artists of Latin American descent to showcase their work. She designed and has been curating the Latin American Speakers Series, for which she has invited internationally renowned contemporary artists and curators to Toronto. Her practice often follows an interdisciplinary approach and touches on notions of memory, identity, diasporas, transnationalism, issues of power, representation, and international artistic cultural interaction. Toledo is presently the director-curator of Sur Gallery, the only space dedicated to contemporary Latin American art in Canada. We're listening to you, Donna.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Celia and Courtney, Roshini, Gina. That was incredible work. Although I wasn't familiar with your work prior to today, I kind of looked through your websites, but it's truly inspiring and resonates with what I'm interested, particularly with this idea of transformation. And I thought that perhaps what I could do is share some of what I'm particularly interested in, what my work has been about, and share some images with you. Just give me a second to figure out how to do this. PowerPoint. Here we go. Yeah, and so I think that this sort of the theme of the forum really resonated with me, and I think that perhaps I was invited as a discussant to touch on notions of how I see myself as an instigator of change, and also how I view my work as a curator, as a scholar, and these ideas of unsilencing the unthinkable. But also as part of the Chilean diaspora. So that's where I kind of wanted to start today. And when I was told about the first memory that came to my mind was when I read the description, was the fact that I've been told so many times to my face that this intention to open a space interested in our art or enough artists of Latin American descent to occupy such a space in Canada. Not only was it a dream, but it was also unthinkable. And so I wanted to again, talk to you a little bit about sort of what my history is and how I can relate to the questions that have been touched on today. So I'm a refugee from Chile, a curator, a visual artist, and a scholar, and I have been curating exhibitions and projects for the past 15 years in Canada. As mentioned, I'm a co-founder of a nonprofit arts organization, LAC, and of Sur Gallery, which is the only space in all of Canada that is dedicated to Latin American and Latinx art. I decided to return to academia after many years of working within the arts industry because I felt the pressing need to address the lack of representation of Latinx and Latin American art. And to a certain extent, I've been able to fulfill this urgency through my curatorial and advocacy work. But I have found that within the parameters of Eurocentric and Western canons, it is almost impossible to be recognized, heard, or even acknowledged. And the thought I thought that the best way would be to insert myself in academia, write and archive and position our stories with the validation it's deserved. There's very little discussion, theoretical observation, research analysis, and scholarly interest in the Latinx diaspora and its art in Canada. Therefore, my intentions are to produce scholarship that acknowledges this underrepresented diaspora and add their voices to a Canadian art history that up until now has been predominantly a white settler narrative. And so this theme of unsilencing the unthinkable interrelates with the work I'm engaged with and believe in, where I attempt to find connections and points of solidarity the relationship that I have with place of origin and the struggles that I have faced throughout my life really determine how I view the world and how I relate these struggles to the land I inhabit today, to the anti-oppressive stance I am committed to, and to the anti-colonial perspective of an unthinkable task, such as of creating this equal representation within the Canadian context. And so since the 1970s, when a wave of Latin American refugees arrived in Canada, escaping military oppression, Latin American artists and political activists explored the way art could affect social change and serve as a platform for civic engagement. Neocolonialism, imperialism, and neoliberalism, with their systemic forms of oppression and exclusion, have been a source of struggle for decades within the global South, and its diaspora has suffered its effects. The struggles of decolonization and anti-colonial perspectives is nothing new to Latin America and its diaspora. And since childhood, I've been formed and nourished by anti-imperialist and solidarity ideologies, and was formed as a politicized entity with a vision to contribute collectively to the betterment of society. My professional career is intrinsically linked to those aspirations and ideologies, and I have followed a path of advocacy within my work with the curatorial projects and scholarship that I engage with. Today in Canada, we face neoliberal and often racist agendas, yet many artists take their stance with new proposals of contestation, emancipation, and reclamation, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and within Indigenous sovereignty struggles that demand reckoning before reconciliation. These social and artistic movements react to centuries of injustices and genocide, and the Latin American diaspora contributes with its own forms of proposals of contestation, forming alliances and modes of solidarity. A long history and a strong legacy of struggle is found within diasporas and within Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. And it is there where we can find spaces of reclamation and identification to support our struggle for a better future. I stand on the shoulders of those who have fought before us, for without their work and resiliency, I, like so many other immigrants and refugees, would face a much harder path. They paved the way for us to confront different challenges and mark our own spaces of resiliency. Their legacy demonstrates that a multicultural, diverse, and inclusive Canada is a myth, for opportunities and benefits are left for a white privileged sector of Canada's population. One cannot pretend that one lives in a place of inclusivity when Latin American diasporic or other marginal stories are not shared, learned, recorded, theorized, or archived. Colonialism as well as coloniality have hindered possibilities of representation and empowerment, and I have witnessed firsthand its impediments. Canada has benefited of an international reputation for welcoming and offering opportunities to immigrants and refugees, promoting multicultural haven to the world. Yet it's important to acknowledge that this reputation is guided by economic interest to capitalize on the labor of immigrants and has not been as welcoming to many diaspora. What I would like to emphasize is this contradiction, for Canada's exclusionary system disempowers, erases, and neglects. But despite this multicultural erasure, an activist Latin American and Latinx artistic community has shared their stories of fear, trauma, and violence with their immediate communities within grassroots and cultural settings, excluded from canonical narratives. This diasporic community of artists have created insular sites of existence and creativity and have offered voices of resistance to an inattentive art circulation. Very few have been granted with the deserving recognition and scholarship within museum and academia of Latin American and Latinx artistic practices is non-existent in Canada. Latin American and Latinx artists have had the resiliency to continue a path of artistic development worthy of our attention, and I believe there is a space to critically examine its contributions and identify value in their work. This diaspora has articulated themes of polarization, displacement, and precariousness. They have studied notions of rupture and crisis in their work, representing manifestations of economic exploitation and inequality, all of which are tied to experiences of loss and trauma. Their work and subjects resonate with our current times of global uncertainty, anxiety, and upheaval, and their objections to neoliberal and colonial systems of power have infiltrated today's contemporary mainstream Canadian art tendencies. These issues are nothing new to this diaspora, a large community which shares a history of war, violence, and struggle. Communities fleeing economic precarity and or political persecution have found within Canada classist and racist systems that have imposed a status of second-class citizens. They have been disempowered for lack of resources, economic precariousness, labor inequalities, language barriers, and systems of knowledge. Not all have had this fate, for language, race, gender, class, and education determine the future of many diasporic communities, often serving as token or are detrimental to the development of their artistic practices. Many artists of the diaspora have contributed with the development of decolonization proposals and have offered an aesthetic of contestation, raising awareness of social and political struggles, carving spaces of representation despite being cast as subaltern or as token subjects. Despite there being a notably progressive recent interest in BIPOC practices, I question the construction of critical discourses that negotiate inclusivity within hegemonic centers. I'm not only interested in the diversification and inclusion of non-hegemonic artistic approaches, but within the relations that follow, the intentions that persist, and the opportunities for growth for those who have been silenced and erased for so long. I believe that as I question concepts of the unthinkable, my place of origin is of relevance. I seek guidance from my ancestors. I look for inspiration from those who lost their lives fighting for human rights. And I claim belonging to a generation who has learned to make Canada a place of home, with the due respect and acknowledgement its original inhabitants deserve. As the daughter of Chilean refugees who came to Canada fleeing political persecution, the political climate right now in Chile is not only of relevance, but can serve as an example to the rest of the world. My family was granted asylum in Canada in '74 after a brutal dictatorship overthrew Allende's government, aided by the US in '73. My family returned to Chile 10 years later, and we lived under a dictatorship that imposed not only a political agenda of fear and persecution, but an economic model, neoliberalism. Exchanges between the US and the Pinochet regime favored free markets, incentivized the economy through increased monetary circulation, and limited the role government played in economic and policy matters. The promotion and consumerism and the privatization of natural resources to privately owned national and foreign corporations was facilitated by a regime that dismantled social and political platforms. Pinochet's dictatorship was used as a testing ground for a neoliberal economic model for the rest of the world. And in the process, thousands of Chileans were murdered, tortured, disappeared, imprisoned, and exiled. After the return to democracy in 1990, a series of elected coalition presidents were no match to the neoliberal phenomenon that would override Allende's vision for a socialist country. And on October 18, 2019, marginalized groups throughout Chile took over the streets to demand change. Students, indigenous peoples, seniors, women, and immigrants had nothing more to lose after 3 decades of democratic administrations and neoliberal economic policies impoverished its population. The massive daily protests ended 5 months later due to the world pandemic. And during this time, we witnessed a resurgence of public art interventions and manifestations. And the role art played in shaping this Chilean political process is undeniable, with artists activating with murals, logos, designs, chants, public installations, and interventions. Las Tesis is a perfect example of this, a collective of feminist artists who used performance and public space to denounce patriarchal systems that protected gender-based violence. Un violador en tu camino, a rapist in your path, created an international wave. Within days, and women across the globe adopted the chant and the choreography to their own struggles. The collective reference the current political state. Blindfolded during each performance, artists reference the people who lost their vision during the social unrest. Police enforcement targeted protesters with rubber bullets directed to their faces, causing many to lose their eyesight. Tens of thousands of women gathered on December 4th, 2019, 2 months after it had become viral worldwide. This time, the performance was held in front of the National Stadium, a symbolic gesture in front of the dictatorship's concentration camp. Women chanted, squatted, and danced, their fists in the air. The power and viscerally unequivocal potency of art sparked people's imaginations and changed perspectives of both older and younger generations of feminists. Since then, an unthinkable outburst of months of social unrest has led to an unimaginable outcome of creative and innovative thinking, changing Chile's political and social landscape. One of the demands of the social uprising was to dismantle Pinochet's constitution of 1980, which ensured the dictator would remain in power. 40 years later, this massive wave of unrest led to the unthinkable, for neither democratic presidencies prior had been able to change the dictatorial constitution. Most recently, the youngest elected president will take power in March of 2022. 35-year-old left-wing Gabriel Boric has promised a challenging platform, one that will inevitably be difficult to achieve, but that has given hope to a country longing for change. We will see what is yet to come. But for now, I believe that is within art that we can find spaces of relief and alternative proposals of contestation to the turbulent past, our current state of uncertainty, and the future that is yet to come. This in-between space that I navigate as a member of a diaspora with a family history of political activism and of uprooting allows for me to find purpose in the work that I do. It offers connections with different points of intersection and within different contexts. That is why when I refer to the unthinkable for someone such as myself, who has struggled with displacement, with discrimination, fear, and with trauma, art is not only an aesthetic choice, but becomes a vehicle that links both worlds, two stories and common struggles. It becomes a tool that facilitates a conversation and establishes common grounds with other diasporas to navigate our existence where we are silenced and erased. And I think that is where this common thread lies, where art becomes a space of solidarity and of an acknowledgement. And that is my presentation. I will stop sharing. And I think that I really wanted to give you a bit of a sense of where I was coming from before making links, because I think there is a lot of common struggles, a lot of points where, you know, a lot of points that we all touch in a certain degree, in different ways, through photography, through installation, through curatorial practice, but that in essence, we are all speaking the same language, which is trying to communicate this idea that there, you know, despite all the silenced and underrepresentation and erasure, as artists, you have the ability to change that. And I think that where the power lies. I don't know, Celia, if you would like to say anything.
Well, I will start by thanking you and thanking all of you for sharing like your work, your stories, your voices. Very inspiring like presentation, I think. I know we're not working with a lot of time, but I hope we'll be able to take a couple of questions. I will look for a sign coming from Cerlac, from Honor, if you're back. And yeah, in the meantime, I know that like people are actually writing questions and our Q&A. So before I get that signed, maybe I can share some of the questions with you. But thank you again. So the first question comes from Catalina Vargas. What can be done from the community to help elevate Latinx artists? I think that's for
I guess that's for me.
yeah.
How do we elevate Latinx artists? I mean, this is my question, and has been my work for so long, for over 15 years. And I think it's been different throughout, it's changed throughout the years, different kind of needs, different time frames. At the beginning of my career, the need to have platforms was important. There was nowhere to exhibit work. None of the galleries, and much less bigger institutions, were interested in artists of the diaspora. And even internationally renowned Latin American artists weren't exhibited in big institutions. So things have changed since then. And I think for me, returning to academia at this stage in my career is mainly because I see the lack in scholarship. And that's sort of what I touched on at the beginning. There's very little written about the diaspora of the Latin American diaspora. So if you are a scholar, I would urge you to do that. If you're in the context of Canada, I'm not sure where you're speaking from, but
Excellent, thank you. I will just like give people more time to phrase new questions, because some of I would say the things that are written in the Q&A are more like comments than actual questions. So I really encourage like our participants to grab like the opportunity to ask questions about the work that our panelists are presenting or have presented. Yeah. So it will take a couple of minutes or seconds, let's say. I think that like I've been told that we can take like around 10 minutes for questions, which is not a lot.
Well, I wonder if in the meantime, while we're waiting for things to percolate, we could maybe have a conversation amongst ourselves, right?
That would be awesome. That was what I was about to suggest. I'm sure that like, you probably have comments and questions, so please feel free to share them.
Well, I'm interested. I'm interested in the fact that we're representing all these different points in the diaspora, yet, we have, what we have in common is the fact that we're artist scholars of one kind or another. So what I would like to, the question I'd like to pose is what it means to navigate these two worlds, right? That, there's information circulating in the academy that's not necessarily in the art world, yet we are a product of both. And what does it mean to do work knowing that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that question, Gina. I feel like, there's sort of maybe two ways of thinking about it. I mean, I think what was so great about your piece and just the way that you kind of called all of these different thinkers into the room through this sort of, kind of repetitive, this sort of practice of repetition, that it was just so powerful. And it made me think about how I see a similar kind of conversation, I think, unfolding between Black feminist thinkers and Black artists. Like, it's been really interesting, for example, looking at the work of someone like Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who's writing entire books around the work of people like Jackie Alexander or Hortense Spillers. And I really sort of felt you doing a similar thing, but also so deeply rooted in your sort of spiritual and ancestral traditions as a Haitian American artist. And so I think, like, in that way, it's actually really productive to straddle both of these worlds and very generative. But I think one of the challenges is trying to think about how to navigate that practice institutionally and what it means to be, Black and brown artists who are sometimes speaking in registers that really remain illegible to the institution in a variety of ways. And it's like, no matter how many ways you try to translate it, there's still a way in which the sort of critiques that I think we're making in our work and the modalities through which we make those critiques are still unrecognized, underappreciated, and undervalued. So it sort of requires, I think, a pivot from thinking about the academy as one's primary audience and sort of reorienting and thinking about how one might engage different kind of publics who are more conversant in the ways that we talk about our work and do our work. So thank you for that question.
I'll just add to that. Thanks very much for the question. I mean, I don't know about you, but I think post-COVID or post, kind of pandemic, I have an incredible, and it could be to do with being across the water, but I have an incredible cynicism of the institutions, and that's whether that's the art institution or the academic institution. And that's because I don't think they're fit for purpose for us, right? And I also don't think that they are in any way particularly, certainly in the UK, there's a level of a more conservative and more conservative and more kind of reactive kind of mode of behavior that isn't taking into consideration what we now need to do, right? So for me, that, the idea of really bringing into question at all times the kind of limitations we're finding ourselves to the of either any institution, whether that's academia or in the arts institution, is really something that I think has really happened and been accelerated through COVID. So the question for me and the excitement for me is also, I mean, Tamara showed some examples of thinking about how artistic practice, of course, is converging with brilliant thinking. It's a kind of interdisciplinary space now that we're operating from, but we also are, I think art making is also occurring in substantially different spaces because of those limitations of those institutions. Mm-hmm. So for me, I'm thinking about autonomy and the unthinkable as being, the kind of thinking outside of the box of the institutions that are constraining us, right? And that is absolutely the art institution. We are now the art market is making work for private funders, for equity people, right? And so capitalism in that sense, comes under question as well, and how it functions and how it supports levels of racism, and this precise kind of divisive mechanism in a way of how we might speak to each other, how we might move forward in a more collaborative way. So I'm very interested in always stepping outside the box, always questioning the institution that we sit within. We all have to sit in the institutions in order to function, but that doesn't mean that we have to accept them for what they are. And part of the decolonial process is precisely that, is absolutely about, which we all are doing, I think, in a way. So thank you for that question. And I just think there's, we have that moment. I always start with my students talking about, well, how do we think about change at this point. We changed pre-COVID, we changed during COVID, everything got disrupted. The ability to think in a much more progressive way is right now. And we have to keep that momentum going, it seems to me. But I'll keep quiet, I'm just kind of, going on a bit, but yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone else on the panel want to share a comment?
I mean, I can just echo what Courtney and Roshini said. I think that definitely things have changed after the pandemic of how we view and work and engage with each other. And I think now is the time to really rethink about how we move forward, how we make new proposals, how we view the institution, how we change the institution. And I think that's sort of why I introduced this example of Chile, not only because I am from there and I'm rooted there, and my place of origin is from there, and all my systems of belief and knowledge come from that experience, but also because there that change is happening, and it is actually happening. Something that can be completely unimaginable in a place like Canada. They're rethinking of how to pluriversalize a constitution, how to change from the root up things of the society completely. And I think that's where we can find inspiration, and that's where we can find sort of how we can move forward and reconceptualize ideas of this idea of transformation, ideas of decolonization.
Thanks a lot. And I think that somehow you kind of already started answering one of the questions we have in the Q&A. So I will probably just open it up to the other panelists. Maybe Gina, you might want to give us your opinion. One of the questions that each of these presentations work in different ways to connect art, activism, solidarity, and social transformation. And so that person is asking how the pandemic has impacted your work and your practice. And also how art might help us to rethink activism and resistance in the context of the pandemic.
Well, I went underground because it was something of a shock that I was in Australia and literally had to run home in the middle of, at the beginning of a biennale, and had to get home before lockdown. I mean, that was just and then I moved to California, and then there were fires and I had to evacuate. And so for me, and I appreciate a lot what Roshini said about the changes before COVID, the changes during COVID, and the changes that are right now. I mean, we are in the midst of transformation, right? So it hit me initially as a shock, all of it, and my system just really was what just happened? But I have this thing that I say California is like Haiti with a lot of money, and some structure, right? Because all the extremities are here. They're all here. I'm in one of the wealthiest little enclaves, but it's also one of the poorest enclaves because a lot of people have housing insecurity, food insecurity. So you see just the gamut. It's also strikingly beautiful, gorgeous between the Pacific and the redwoods, but then you've got all these fires, you've got all these environmental challenges. So the that chaos became an invitation out of survival. Actually, I had to kind of slow down. And I wasn't going that fast to begin with. And what it did is just asked me, I like to talk about this sort of method or methodology of surrender. I surrendered to what was happening because I was like, I'm not going to become a casualty of capitalism. I mean, it's out to take you out, right? You know, I mean, that's what it feels like. And then I had to just stop and, you know, I refused to perform online because, again, there's this way for me where Zoom University, you know, it's like people don't consider half an hour between meetings anymore because you're available and everything can be back to back. And then so it's like, well, what's happening to my body? What's happening to my system? What's happening to my breathing? And if I'm not aware of that, then how do I show up as an educator, as a human being? How do I show up in the world? So my work is now so much about nature because my only part of my solace was the woods, and the relationship to land, like land-based. And there's a way that I think that oftentimes that relationship is wrongly characterized as very Eurocentric because of who the naturalists and have been taught to be, when in reality, you have both a history of indigenous presence, you know, that preceded this sort of violent colonial encounter. And then whether you're talking about Afro-diasporic based religious practices, the connection to the land was always there. And so for me, I think one of the most beautiful thing that has happened is that. And now I'm trying to, you know, I'm working with what's in front of me and then figuring out what does that mean. It changed a lot. I think it made me a calmer person. I think it made me, you know, I go to my class and we start with a meditation because I'm just like, oh, we got to breathe deep these days. Just like, gosh, slow it down. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gina. Okay, so yeah, we don't have a lot of time left, but like there's so like a lot of important questions. So I'm gonna ask Courtney, like, if you have thoughts to share about like maybe like the impact that the pandemic had on your work and praxis, but also I'll share one of the questions that is on the Q&A. And that person is asking if you can give an account of the relationship between Bluefields, Nicaragua, and Jamaica. That's like not an easy one.
Yeah.
But in terms of, I'll just let you deal with the questions the way you want to.
Well, I mean, I'm certainly able to explain the relationship historically between Bluefields and Jamaica. Whether that's possible within the scope of time we have left, that's probably not likely. But yes, there is a very long historical relationship between, you know, folks living on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua and Jamaica. I mean, particularly because, you know, there was a point where that part of the country was a British protectorate. And so they answered, the sort of closest governing structure was located in Kingston. So they were, you know, there were like longstanding diplomatic ties, cultural ties, commercial ties specifically between Jamaica and many people who, you know, currently are considered Creole in Nicaragua are people who came to that part of the world by way of Jamaica through processes of labor migration over, you know, many decades, from world centuries, really, from the 17th century through the 19th and well into the early 20th century. So those relationships are, you know, longstanding and continue to sort of animate political, sort of social memory and people's ideas around their own sense of cultural identity and ongoing ties, cultural and otherwise, to the Caribbean. But, you know, in terms of thinking about how the pandemic has affected my practice, I mean, you know, I think for many of us, this has been a moment where we have had to really kind of turn and to think and to sort of work from these sort of more everyday intimate spaces, right? And for me, you know, so much of my creative practice is about being in place. Like when I'm making work about my family's migrations from Jamaica to South Florida, and I want to talk about their relationship to sugar, I need to be in the cane fields. When I want to talk about the impact of the oil industry on my mother's family and how the sort of the legacy of Jim Crow lives on in the body in particular kinds of ways, I go to those places. I think, you know, one of the things I was thinking, and so listening to Roshini talk about her work and thinking about sort of what it means to kind of make art in the Anthropocene from a kind of Caribbean perspective, and from the perspective of women cultural workers who are grappling, who are really living on the front lines of the climate disaster that, you know, that is unfolding in the sort of it's a sort of slow unfolding, you know, and then also thinking about the way that, you know, Gina is sort of thinking about like these sort of egum practices and like the kind of ancestor veneration work that's happening and the sort of reclamation of these ancestral spiritual traditions. You know, it feels like this is a moment where time feels really strange, like time kind of slowed down in this weird way. And so I found myself sort of thinking about what it means to sort of think about the past, the present, and the future, to sort of reorient our sort of temporal frames for thinking about the, you know, thinking about the social world, and how art can be kind of a portal for time travel, you know, and like that's kind of what I've been thinking a lot about. And so my practice has really shifted, I think, to like thinking about what kind of memories live in my own body, how I can kind of tap into that, those forms of knowledge that live in my body. Also, you know, connecting with nature, you know, the spiritual traditions that I'm connected to are all nature-based. So it's been a real kind of opportunity to dive deeply into those practices in a way that I think prior to the pandemic, I was certainly thinking about, but now have kind of taken on a much more, they just feel more resonant. And I feel the power and like the possibility of those practices in a way that I think I hadn't fully appreciated before. So that's kind of where my work is at the moment. And it's also been a moment to try to, you know, to slow down and try out different kind of genres and forms of practice that I think before I hadn't really done. So doing more video work, and revisiting previous work that I had done, as in the case of the work with Nicaragua, that when I took it, I was just like, oh, I don't know what this is. And now I'm like, oh, actually, maybe this is something. And I have time to sit with it. So I'm just trying to make the most of that. Anyway.
Thanks a lot. I think that like we're getting to the end of our conversation. Roshini, would you like to share last like thoughts or ideas with us regarding your practice or like future directions?
I mean, I was just thinking about the pandemic, and I won't say much more, but I was thinking about the way in which, you know, as Gina said, we kind of slowed down, and we also were, for me, it was about questioning what we were doing with our time, right? Who we were spending time with, how much time we were spending, you know, and of course that particularly was in relation to work and making work. So in work in the institutions and making work. So that for me was something. And then I think the other thing that really struck me was, you know, and I think that was something that I really picked up on when thinking about the place of archive and the place of history and all of our different practices, was, you know, who we were listening to. So there was something quite interesting and fascinating about the agency that Black women activists were having in all of our practice, which of course might, you know, be very obvious, but I think that there is a very real focus now to really think through the kind of historical trajectory of that process in a way that's quite urgent. So for me, it was about that kind of selection process of who I was listening to, these masses of Zoom kind of lectures and talks and explosion of culture that was going on, and we were very selective about, you know, the opportunity to be selective of what we were listening to and what we were hearing and who we wanted to hear really became quite an important aspect for me. And then I think the other thing that, you know, just picking up on what Courtney and Gina were talking about in relation to this kind of thinking about land and the relationship of more than human space, if you like. And I was thinking about, you know, a kind of about my practice. So the reflexive process of the practice in relation to it not being extractive, right? So how do we think about a non-extractive process of being, of making, and by non-extractive, I'm thinking about, we're extracting, as scholars, we extract knowledge from people, right? So how do we do that in a way that actually is about respect and is about equity and is about, contains all of the kind of values that we want to embed now in a way. And that's a very interesting kind of thing to think about, because ultimately we are still making work from listening and hearing life experiences around us from other people, right? How do we do that in a way that's collegiate, that's kind of recognizes and respects people? So for me, that was really something that I'm taking away and I'm continuing to think about. So thank you for your question.
Thank you so much. I think it's probably the perfect way to conclude our conversation, because it definitely helps us to think about art as like a place of solidarity, like counter narrative, counter archive, but also a place of solidarity and relationality. So that's just really perfect. I will thank you again for being with us and sharing your work. I don't know that our format actually allows us to participants to share reactions, but I'm sure that they would if they could. So thank you again for this beautiful and inspiring conversation.